Welcome to today's lecturette. I'm Dr. Leslie Jones, and today we're going to be exploring perceptions of quality. We're going to ask ourselves, what do we mean when we actually talk about high quality in early learning? What does our government mean when they talk about high quality? And what are the mechanisms for measuring, validating, and monitoring high quality in the early years? And then we're going to take a critical look at the concept of quality as a socially constructed phenomenon. The discourse on quality in the early years sector has been an active debate for decades, for good reason. Governments, researchers and educators have sought to understand the drivers and elements that make up high quality and to work towards ensuring that a sector-wide delivery of these components of quality early learning are there for the benefit of all children. Suraj et al. Makes the point that the growing body of empirical research identifies the importance of the early years. They make the point that successive studies indicate that the benefits of a high-quality early learning program in providing both short-term and long-term benefits for children's development and educational successes, and highlight the possibility of redressing some of the inequities in opportunities and outcomes that is associated with socioeconomic disadvantage. Equally, there is also a body of evidence to indicate that programs of lower quality not only do not realise these benefits, but also have some detrimental impacts on children's development. Given this evidence base, it's not really surprising that governments, professionals and communities alike want some sort of assurances that what is being delivered to children in our local communities is of a high quality. In response to the evidence, there has been an international trend towards the professionalisation of the early learning sectors across the globe. Australia has joined this international trend with the introduction of contemporary policy initiatives over recent years, and in particular in the last decade, that have outlined mandatory aspects of quality, including the national quality standards and underpinned by the EYLF, and a process of benchmarking and rating the standards with ongoing assessment cycles. Adding to the growing body of evidence around the importance of the early years and the nature of quality is the research in neuroscience that has really driven much of the first 5 years agenda. And this research has highlighted the importance of those first 5 critical years in child development. Neuroscience has evidenced the rapid growth of infant and young children's brains in the first 5 years, and that the quality of experiences affect the overall number of synapses development over this period of time. In fact, the brain development that occurs in the first 5 years is more than at any other time in the lifespan. The richer the early experiences from a range of sensory inputs and interactions, the more synapse development occurs. This research has brought into sharp focus the critical reflection and assessment of the types of environments that infants and young children are exposed to, and has added immeasurably to the quality debate. This research has provided a call to action of sorts for governments and educators alike to ensure that the window of opportunities in these first few years of a child's life are optimised, underpinning the importance of the quality of the experiences children engage in during those first few critical years. It is not surprising then that governments, armed with this evidence, have made explicit policy focus on raising the level of quality in the early learning program provision market, and seek mechanisms to measure quality and to trace improvements of programs over time. This has not only influenced public policy, but has led to the development of early childhood education learning frameworks that seek to operationalise the focus of government policy, objectives and initiatives to provide high quality early learning education programs and experiences for young children. As multiple stakeholders, such as government, educators, providers and families, work to ensure children have access to high quality programs, creating a shared understanding of what that actually means has been a significant piece of work for the sector to negotiate. Governments in many countries have implemented systems and processes to monitor and assess the levels of quality in their EC sectors. And of course, that includes Australia in the national quality standards that have been implemented since 2012. In earlier lecturettes, we've actually spoken about the NQS rating and assessment results since the implementation of the national quality standards, and that quality since 2012 has continued to improve. And certainly the 2019 snapshot results indicate that nearly 80% of the some 16,000 early learning services have achieved a rating of meeting or above, which is extremely encouraging. The NQS, however, has already undergone some iterative refinements as the Australian Government continues to focus on benchmarking, assessing and monitoring the levels of quality that underpin our early learning programs and services. Given that the rating and assessment processes under the NQS are only about 6 years post-implementation, it's interesting to note the revisions that have already occurred. And I think highlights that the thinking around quality continues to evolve and refine as we try to work out a manageable system that can still give us relevant data that is responsive to local community requirements and educator skill. So if we think about the ways in which we monitor, assess and validate the quality that we see in our early learning programs, we can start to begin to deconstruct the notion a little bit around quality into two distinct aspects, one around processes and one around structural components of quality. Structural components are the enabling conditions that allow quality to actually be enacted, while process aspects of quality rely on the interpersonal aspects of interactions and relationships that underpin and work within the context of the environment. So some examples of structural components of quality as enabling features to allow quality practices and pedagogies to be enacted include things such as the qualification requirements and things like educator-child ratios. And as we know, qualification requirements were increased under the NQF in 2012 for a minimum requirement of Certificate 3 as part of the push towards a professionalisation of the educator workforce working in the early years. And of course, there have been additional requirements to employ qualified teachers in long day care services in particular that are also part of this structural process to enable an improvement in overall quality. Educator-child ratios were another aspect of structural processes of quality, and they were also lowered with the introduction of the NQF in 2012 in response to some of the evidence around the process aspects of quality, and that being time educators can actually spend in relationships and interactions with young children that better the quality outcomes for children. So then if we look at some process aspects of quality, they include the practices and pedagogies that early childhood educators engage in. So things like play-based pedagogies are a specific process that is the hallmark of an early childhood quality program, as is program planning that focuses on child-led and individual planning processes. Of course, there are many more structural and process aspects of quality that must be coalesced to produce a holistic nature of an early childhood education program. But in critically reflecting on the overall quality of early childhood programs, it is helpful to begin to see these two dimensions of quality. This can be particularly helpful for individual educators and teachers and service providers as they assess and reflect their own levels of quality and develop their own quality improvement journey. In Australia, we know that quality is assessed through the National Quality Standards and the rating and assessment processes that gather evidence of a service provider's continuous improvement journey across the 7 quality areas. Many countries around the world employ a similar regulatory audit or accreditation style process to benchmark, monitor and assess the quality of individual service providers and their programs, as well as using that data to inform an aggregate view of an overall sector's level of quality in both snapshot set data but also in trend data tracing improvement over time. There have also been a range of assessment type style tools developed that are not regulatory requirements but provide an even more granular review of the structural and process aspects of quality in services. While the NQS and A&R processes assess a whole of centre environment, there are tools that can assist educators and service providers with a more granular room by room and educator by educator profile of how quality is actually unfolding in their services. The Early Childhood Environmental Rating Scale, or the ECHAS-E, and the Shared Sustained Thinking and Emotional Wellbeing Scale, or the STEW scale, are well-known rating scales that have been used in many countries and many services that can be used to help build up a very detailed room-by-room view of aspects of quality. educators and service providers can see where they're delivering well and where there is room for some further thinking and possible change. Exploring alternative and additional tools such as the ECAZ and STEW highlights that the notion of quality is not fixed, and quality as defined by the NQS is but one view of how quality is actually defined and enacted. Rather, it highlights that quality is an evolving concept that will continue to change and refine over time. The development of tools such as the ECAZ and STEW highlight the opportunities for individual educators and service providers to move beyond a compliance and systems view of quality to the potential of a more individualised quest for professional renewal and the improvements that are anchored in the context of their own educational settings. As we continue to think about how we understand and position quality, I'd like to offer a provocation about how we think about quality and is it interchangeable with assessment and validation. The quote that you can see on your screen from Moss and Dahlberg suggests that quality speaks of a universal expert-derived norms and of criteria, often expressed as a number, of the extent to which services or practices conform to these norms. Moss and Dahlberg go on to make the claim that the discourse on quality as we currently define it positions the construct in a positivistic and technical construct that are instrumental and calculating by nature. They go on to assert that as a construct, quality is heavily inscribed with implicit values generated by acknowledged experts and a sense of certainty that quality can be easily replicated at scale, that quality has a linear progress and is predetermined through cause and effect outcomes. They challenge this notion as they feel that this presents a problem in how we explore what quality means within the context of individual services. In problematising the notion of quality, they have questioned that it can be so easily defined, prescribed and measured, and go further to claim that quality is not self-evident, but in fact saturated with the dominant views, assumptions, and is a constructed concept, and that the normative views are a political act representing the imperatives and discourses of the time, emphasising some characteristics while excluding or diminishing other elements of the discourse. Importantly, they go on to assert that the notion of quality in contemporary discourse has become interchangeable with the notion of evaluation. And even if we simply reflect on the notion of quality in general, we can quickly begin to see that quality may mean very different things to different people. And in doing so, highlights quite quickly the significant challenge when we are trying to define quality for a whole sector. As multiple stakeholders such as governments, educators, providers and families work to ensure children have access to high quality programs, creating a shared understanding of what that actually means has been a significant piece of work for the sector. And so finally, in this session, I would like to give you an alternative view of how we might define and understand quality beyond compliance and beyond the normative standards that we are so comfortable in working with. And Moss and Dahlberg would go on to suggest that in order to reframe our notions of quality beyond the compliance of established norms requires a move to deconstruct our perceptions and notions of quality in general. They suggest there is a need to critically examine individual perceptions of things like, what is your image of child? And what do you as an individual professional want for children? And what are your views on the purposes of education and care? They go on to highlight that critical reflections of these types of big questions assumes that you have a professional who can make, in relation to others, a contextualised, subjective and rigorous judgment of values. And in doing so, educators engage in a democratic political practice of collective deliberations around what quality actually means to them in the context of their own educational settings. You may recall in one of our very early lecturettes, we spoke of Bronfenbrenner's ecological model and of the somewhat unidirectional view of influence from the macro system to the micro, and the recognition that children also influence up and out of the microsystem as well. We can apply this same provocation to our discussion on quality. At present, our notions of quality are heavily influenced by information and professional norms handed to us by governments and the macro system. What might be the influence and impact of a rigorous evaluative and individual judgment of quality within the context of the micro and meso systems produced? How might educators, children, and families influence up and outwards from the current form of discourse? These are provocative notions, and of course, we still have to work within the system that has its existing compliance and process frameworks well established. But as a professional working in a fast-paced profession, this type of critical thinking is necessary to keep our practices, while anchored in policy, innovative and responsive to the local children, families, and the community needs and contexts that we will face every day. Thank you for joining me for today's lecture, Ed. I hope you found it a little bit interesting and perhaps just a little bit provocative. I look forward to sharing more time with you in our next session as we begin to explore our focus in Module 2 on communities.